Hey everybody, Pete Meier, Motor Age Magazine. Thanks and welcome to our Facebook Live event today. Kind of aptly named Shop Talk. Kind of a new thing for us. Hopefully the first and many more to come. Before we get started with today's guest, just a few housekeeping things. So turn that down, get out of the way. We are monitoring the Facebook feed, but there is a short delay. So if you have any questions for George or comments about the conversation, we're not ignoring you. We're just a little bit ahead, behind of what you're seeing. So we'll keep on like we're doing. And again, it is a live event, new platform. So if you see me look off to the side a little bit, then you know that I'm just kind of checking on everything, making sure we're all good. And with that said and done, let's go ahead and bring in our guest, get him set up there. Of course, we had a few little issues there in the beginning that we're kind of clarifying, so just give me 1 second, and we'll get all that right. All right, I think that's coming through. And anyway, without further delay, let me bring forth Mr. Jorge Menchu. George, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Pete. Good talking to you, and thanks for putting all this together.
Well, I appreciate, of course, you're taking the time to hang out with me today on Facebook Live. It is a new event. We've had our share of trials and tribulations to make it work, but it's a learning curve, like anything else that we do as technicians, right?
Yeah, nothing like a new adventure and pushing the envelope.
Yeah. Okay, so there's the first issue there. A little audio, fix that. A little audio feedback. Nope, that should be all right. Yeah, I'm still there.
All right.
Like I said, guys, it's a live event, first time, new platform for me, so I'm kind of learning all the little nuances there. So anyway, the whole topic today, George and I have talked a couple of times about doing this. There, if you've got that button, hit that one too. About just getting together, have a general conversation. We've been in the business, both of us, a long time, and we've seen a lot of things change, and we're seeing a lot of things continuing to change. But there's a lot of new talent coming up, behind us. So the whole goal for today was to kind of talk a little bit about, especially where George came from and the lessons he's learned, and about where he's at in the business, and where he sees us going forward in the future. So let me start with that first, George. Let's talk about how you got in the automotive business in the first place.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I'm really not sure how I actually got there. It just kind of developed very organically. I always had this, ever since I was very young, I've always had this interest in cars. Well, actually, this is probably how I got into it, watching racing. When I was a little kid, I remember running around running around my house, acting like I was in a race car. So that's probably what got my interest. And I always loved watching racing. When I was 12 years old, I got a go-kart and a little McCulloch 91B1 and worked on that a lot. And it's just a lot of little things happened that just kept me interested in engines particularly. But I've always had a fascination, like many of us here in the industry, with mechanics. Like, for example, trains. The gear system and how trains work. As a little kid, I'm just thrilled at looking at things like that. So I think that's kind of what got me there. And then, of course, when I started going to high school, there's this great automotive program at Temple High School in Temple, Texas, and joined up. And it just started from there. I think that was, the key step right there. And so that's what got me into cars. So I went from high school to working on cars. And one of the most fortunate things that happened during high school is my first big project in high school was working on a 1968 Volkswagen Fastback, which is, if anybody's familiar with that, that's fuel injected. So it had been sitting for years in a box. And for some reason, I just gravitated towards it and started the process of following instructions and getting it all put back together. And I did get it running. I did not get it running perfect, though. It was running rich. And of course, years later, there was one thing I had to do. It was pretty simple, and I probably could have fixed that running rich, and that was take the sensor apart, the manifold sensor apart, and get the oil out of it. But I did get it running. So too bad I can't go back there and get that oil out. But anyway, so that immediately working on fuel injection, working on foreign cars. I bought a Volkswagen and I wanted to hot rod it a little bit. So that got me into the shops. And so that's what started my career in automotive repair, an interest in engines. And at that time, trying to make a fast Volkswagen with little money.
So that's like you're enjoying like the Volkswagens themselves, huh?
Oh, yeah. And when I was in the shops, we worked on Datsun, Toyotas, Hondas, and whatever, but primarily Volkswagens for many of the years. Yeah. And enjoyed it a lot. I mean, it was thrilling. I mean, over the years, I got to build hundreds of engines, do the valve jobs, cut the valves, just every aspect you can think of, line boring and just, the whole gamut. And that was a pretty exciting time. A lot of technicians today will never build an engine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, loved every minute of it. And also the people I worked with, it was great. I always worked for really great people that I had a good time with. So it was just an absolutely spectacular experience.
Well, I kind of wondered too, George, then based on the experience that you had there, to go from that to what you're doing now, tell me a little more about how you made that transition from technician to founding a company.
To AES. Okay. So let me step back into my past a little bit. When I was 12 years old, my grandfather died, and we went up to Helena, Montana to go spend time with my grandmother, and this is on my mother's side. And man, I walked into this house and it was just like, for someone who's just naturally interested in mechanics and the way things work and craftsmanship, it was fantastic. He's got every Life magazine in there, every National Geographic, every popular mechanics. And I went through them all. He had this book of Leonardo da Vinci with all of his drawings. I go down in the basement and I find his books of all of his drawings for the house that he built, him, my grandmother, and my mom. It's just thrilling. And it was very, very inspiring. So I think it was probably at that point I wanted to be an inventor. So that was key to what happened. So when I was working on cars, I'd always been working on fuel injection and doing electronic problems, and I loved them. And of course, when you're not so big, you can climb under the dash pretty easy too. So that was an advantage. So I'm just pointing this out because that was my behavior and that was my influence that still influences me today. What happened when we went to Helena, Montana. And then, of course, my dad was a very big inspiration, too. He was a scientist. He did a lot of cool stuff. Making vaccines. And so I got to be around that. I wasn't involved in it in any way, of course, but got to be around it. So I had a lot of great influences. So I'm working on cars and I want to be an inventor. So I thought, well, what do I do? I'm going to learn electronics. So I go to the University of Radio Shack and I get the Getting Started in Electronics book. And I start building circuits because I want to learn electronics. And one of the things to keep in mind here is that when you compare to what's going on today to where we were then, there is a big difference. Today, everything is extremely complex. So the way I look back at the past, it was kind of easy stuff in comparison. But it was harder to learn it, especially for a guy like myself. I went to high school, I'm working in a shop. So I got to spend my spare time in this Getting Started in Electronics book was fantastic. So I started building these circuits, and now it's teaching me how to deal with electronics. And over time, of course, you start doing more complex circuits. Probably one of the most exciting and complete projects I did was at the time this company in Australia had made that first injector cleaning machine. I think they did the first one, so I certainly couldn't afford the $5,000 to get one, so I made one. I took a D-Jetronic computer apart, took out the driver circuit, and then through a transformer, I set that up to power my unit and to do dividing circuits to set the clock so I could set different RPMs. And that was probably my first product, but was only for me. And followed it through all the way to calling up the engineers at the chemical companies and finding out what were the best fluids and the safest ones, because you don't want to make a bomb. So I built that, and I started cleaning injectors, working a lot of Volkswagens, Datsun, Toyotas. You take the head off, let's get those injectors and make sure they're flowing even. So did that for a while. And so the next thing that happened, and I'll try to keep this short, is I wanted to get more involved in electronics. I went to a copier repair shop. They were going to hire me, let me work in the warehouse, and during that time I would learn how to do that. Almost took the job, decided not to. And that's when I came up with the idea of why don't I spend my energy taking a lab scope that I'm using all the time on my projects and making a kit to make it convenient to use on cars. So the next thing you know, I'm walking up and down Belmont Street out here in California, helping not just myself, but the other shops who were all friends. They were experts in Toyota and GMs and Fords. And here I came in with an expertise of electronics and how to use the test equipment. And so what I'm going to tell you right now, I think is very, very important. So if you're out there listening, you're a young guy, think about this. And especially if you're a teacher, think about what I'm about to tell you here. And let me throw this in. If you're a student, this is key. So I take the time to master electronics. You got a shop down the street who is a master of Chevrolet or Ford. So what happened is I would go to help them, and together we were a very powerful duo, because as the expert on the Ford or GM, they knew what they needed to know. And then as the expert in electronics, where I looked at everything from electronics perspective, which from that perspective, it's all the same. They tell me what they want to look at. I would do the connection, get it on the lab scope, and interpret it for them. So together we had immediate value. So there's an underlying pattern here that's a very important lesson. If you're a student trying to learn something, you find a shop where you might want to work, and you analyze that shop and you find the gaps of what they're missing. So if you go to a medium-sized shop that doesn't have an electronics expert, go learn electronics and bring that to them right out of school, and you'll have immediate value. So you don't have to be them. You don't have to be an expert in car. You just have to be this complement. So for me, doing that, it opened a lot of doors. And so my next step, of course, was one day I quit my job, had $500 to my name, because I thought I could sell my test lead kits. But probably the most important thing is I felt I was on a mission, because I knew how important this could be. I knew the value it was for diagnostics, and probably even more important for the learning process. So that's what started AES. But here, let me give you another tip. I had a rule, and that rule was, and this has to do with starting a business, the day I have to borrow money to pay my own personal bills is the day I go back and get a regular job. So I had this clicking point. And so what happened was I was almost at that point, and there was a trade show coming up in Northern California, the AESC California Northern Trade Show. And I didn't have enough money to go there. And so I'm trying to figure out, well, how do I get there? And I got my bank statement, and I made a deposit that I forgot about, and I didn't put in my ledger. And man, I was thrilled, because now I could afford to go to the trade show. So, and it's odd, because that trade show, things started turning around, because back then, to sell a lab scope to somebody was trying to find that one person in a whole city that could see the value. So, Pete, a lot of times I'd go into the shop and say, hey, you guys, look what I got. Let me show you what it can do. And they would point to a scan tool and say, we already got one. We're busy, thanks. So it was difficult.
Yeah.
So it was pioneering. You had to pioneer one person at a time.
Yeah. But I think there's a few key things here that you mentioned that I'd like to kind of highlight, if you don't mind. And the one was referring to going to those shops that you have an interest in working at as a young tech or a tech who's finishing up their training, and to see what their needs are. And when you said electronics, all I could think of, well, that's just about every shop in the country right now. The systems that we have in place that are growing, the AES systems in particular, where close enough is not good enough anymore,
Right.
And a lot of the shops that are in place that are filled with the older guys like you and I, many of them tend to continue to just keep on keeping on the way they always have. And they think they can take that same repair approach to that 2018 model that they did to that 1968 model, and it just doesn't work that way, right? So
it's a difficult situation too, because of all the other pressures in life, and it's and I just saying that because for some guys, they just are in this middle of this fast-paced changing environment, and even for a full-time working tech who has the energy and doesn't have a family or something like that who can just concentrate on, it's even hard for them to keep up.
Oh yes, and that's something that we've talked about numerous times. And for those of you who are watching or will be watching this afterwards, I just want to tell you that one of the things that I've always appreciated about George and many of the other industry, for lack of a better word, icons that we all know and love, is the fact that, sure, George has a business. Sure, George has products that he wants to sell. But at the same token, when he attends these events, especially as a trainer, and he's not there for that. If you attend any of his sessions, I've never, ever seen any sessions where George was touting, oh, and by the way, you can go to the booth and pick this up after I'm done. Never, ever done that. He's always been there to help the next generation come along, or even those who are in my age group. And he has two fantastic programs that he does, both one on interpreting waveforms and one on how to read and interpret a schematic wiring diagram. That's just taking all of his experience in electrical and electronics, the background that he has, the engineering that he's brought to the table. But more than that, and I think I want to kind of hit on that a little bit, George, because we've talked about this before. That's not the only focus of either one of those classes, is it?
No, not at all. But one of the things you did say that I'd want to qualify a little further is these two classes are the accumulation of my study of my experiences and the experiences I've had with everyone over the years. And some people say, well, hey, for example, in the wiring diagram class, you're using the same two wiring diagrams, but I do it for a reason. And it's the classes have become an accumulation of my experience with everybody, and of course with mine. And it's morphed and changed over the years. And sometimes I'm experimenting with just changing one word to see how people will respond to it or how it affects people. And so the class can be about electronics, if that's where the conversation goes. The class can be about a waveform. But the one thing that I'm very passionate about, and I tell people that probably, well, in my estimation, is probably the most important thing that I've been able to contribute to the industry, and of course that's my opinion, but it's a class about the way we learn and the way we solve problems. And in a way, for me, I look at it as kind of a celebration of who we are, because for me, it's a connection of the mechanics of the way everything works. And We get to live and breathe it all the time. So here's what I'm doing with these classes is I got this subliminal part of it, which is literally about reinforcing what we do naturally. If we have parts and pieces that we have to assemble, we do it naturally. And so I'm doing it through my exercises. And in fact, if you were to really analyze a lot of these exercises, I'm doing the same thing over and over. And it can be categorized. It's a styled thinking. So to categorize all the exercises, I'm just teaching techniques for organizing. And so why is this important? Well, if you consider today that you want to go learn something, just go type it in YouTube and you can find videos from experts from all around the world. Pick a subject, you can do that. But the one subject that you're not going to find a YouTube video about is you. And so these classes, the underlying thing is about helping people discover about themselves and the way they learn and the way they think and the way they solve problems. And so my goal is to help develop behaviors of what I think works and awarenesses so they can start evaluating themselves. And some of the feedback that I've gotten over years from people with learning disabilities, people with great challenges, people with insecurities, and people who are just good at stuff who just love mechanics, say, oh my God, this works. Probably one of the most important compliments I have that, this is kind of a different category of a compliment, was a friend of mine. He has a degree in information technology. He came and he sat in the class and he said, hey, look, what I just learned in getting my degree, you just taught in my class. And the great compliment of that is I am just expressing through my wiring diagrams, through the waveform analysis, the joy of mechanics that all of us do all the time. So just think about this, Pete. If I can teach you to take your experience in the shop, understanding mechanics, how things come apart, how you analyze all the different parts, how they come together, and they create a structure, and then how that structure can start with an input and make an output, and learn how to follow that process. Learn how to put a test lead right there in the center of that process and know what the problem's on the left or right. Know if it's action or reaction. Those fundamental behaviors from the perspective of mechanics, it opens up the door because you start seeing the similarity between everything you do, and it empowers you. So that's what's important to me, that's the love I have of teaching the class. Do people see it that way? I don't know.
Well,
but that's the way I see it.
You've been doing this class for I don't know how many years, and you're still filling classrooms, then there's certainly, I would say that people absolutely understand the benefit of it. And again, it's not just the lessons learned on how to interpret that schematic or how to interpret that waveform, but as you pointed out, it's developing those inherent critical thinking skills that sets a good diagnostic technician or a good technician period apart from a parts changer.
Yeah. So let me touch on the wiring diagrams for a second. So, the one color wiring diagram, color coding has application, two color, the three color. They all have great application. There are times where you want to use them. But when it comes to learning and being thorough and engineering like, the way that I've got the color coding presented, it does a handful of things. It helps you to organize the diagram. And one of the most amazing things is it can also lead you to a point of interest in the diagram. And so you think of this as a process of just organizing your head. So you got this visual exercise about taking all these variables and organizing them. So again, underneath all of this is developing that behavior. And the great thing about the wiring diagrams is they allow us to, for example, follow two different paths to see if we came to the correct answer. So in the process of doing that, we turn on this self-awareness to know the difference between, hey, I know exactly what this is and it has to be this way, as opposed to, yeah, it's that way. So you can hear my voice right there, a little hesitation, right? Well, my goal is to help you hear that little hesitation in your voice. So I'll do it again. Yes, it's this way. I know it is. It's a fact. Yeah, it's always that way. No, it's always that way. Are you sure? You know? So that's an example of one of the behaviors these diagrams help us come out with. But if you're also trying to learn electronics, so imagine this, I've got all these variables in front of me. I got a complex diagnosis, I got pressure to get it done, and I got this complex diagram in front of me. Well, it's like having a bunch of puzzle pieces thrown on the table. So what do you say we just take a minute and organize it, and we make it manageable? All right, so through the color coding, through the other fundamental experience that you have in life, which is what I'm trying to do, is make the connection to. So you can see, hey, I do this over here naturally. I do it over here naturally. Now I'm taking those natural processes, I'm applying it to a diagram. And now I'm going to take the experience I got from the diagram and I'm going to apply it to the next complex thing that I'm going to do. And that's for me, one of the joys of doing AES. So having a high school education, Pete, what has driven me is the love of learning and trying to figure things out. When I was in high school, I purposely used to not listen to the teachers because half the fun for me was, can I figure it out, myself in the time that we're supposed to get the homework done. Of course, I wasn't always successful. There were a lot of C's on my report cards, but I was exercising that skill. And so in the process of starting AES, like when I was writing the AES waveform analysis, which for all of you young folks, that was originally written based on DOS as opposed to Windows 10. So DOS is like a long time ago. So I was teaching myself to write write a program, and I started from scratch to write that program and ended up a very professional level program. Of course, thanks to the help of Corey Glassman from Fluke. Fluke actually took that program, put it into their catalog, and they did advertisements on it, which that was a big thing. But the process is, how do I write this complex program? Well, you start picking up these things. How do I engineer this? You have to deal with complexity. And if you look in the engineering field, they are experts in dealing with complexity. And if you step back and you look at what they do, you can see those patterns and you can start applying it. And in fact, I've written articles about this. They're still out there. I don't know the name of the articles, but so this color coding class is also about my experiences of taking on these big challenges and starting out from scratch and going to the library, going to the bookstores, and just sitting down and doing my best to figure it out.
Yeah, that's really the big difference today, though, isn't it? I mean, now we have Google. So finding the access to that information that you had to go down to the public library or to the local college or pull out those fiche machines to go back to old data. I mean, these are some things that a lot of the techs who are watching with us today, they might have read about in a history book, but they're certainly not having to rely on that for their information sources. It's just so much more available. But at the same token, guys, just because it's online doesn't mean it's all right. So you have to make sure that you vet those sources and you're using something that is giving you factual information. We've seen that time and time and time again. And it's almost assuming here that the link between your passion for your own learning growth, you share that clearly in the classes that you teach, and you have that underlying message in how those lessons are brought together. They're the same steps that you're incorporating in that. And I think, like you said, that's something as a technician, that's one of the things that a lot of us bring to the job, is that desire to beat whatever that problem might be, right? To overcome.
Yeah.
And like you said, breaking it down into manageable pieces rather than trying to eat that elephant all at one time. But I got to ask you this too. the lessons that you learn as a technician certainly come across, and when you share that type of information on things that are technical in nature. But how did what you learn in those processes impact your role as a businessman?
Well, my experience as an automotive technician was very helpful because, again, everything that I do, I try to pattern off of the fundamental, it's fundamental patterns of mechanics. I probably say that too much, but it's been one of the greatest gifts. It's one of the most powerful things that's happening in the industry. I mean, you look around, look at how amazing many of the people are within our industry. The powerful brains that are out there. And I attribute a lot of that to just what we do for a living. I mean, you're getting paid every day to go in the shop and solve problems and figure things out. And, you're teaching yourself. We're a field of expert learners, but you got to remember that. So going back to your original question, you might have to re-ask it. I go on these sidetracks, and I apologize, Pete. So ask your question.
No. In fact, it's quite all right. I mean, we were going, and in fact, I'm going to roll with what you started, because the question was, of course, how it impacts your role as a businessman.
Oh, yeah.
And I can only assume, and I'm sure that's pretty clear to everybody who's watching. The same critical thinking skills can be applied to whatever situation you're happening to be facing, whether it's a business-related problem, or it's a technical problem, or it's a customer service problem, or it's a family problem, or whatever the case might be. It's being able to take the time to think about it, break it down into what the underlying roots are, and then taking action on it. But I want to kind of continue with what you just said.
Okay.
Because I have to think that in a lot of cases, like, we both know Bernie Thompson, and I'm sure a lot of folks here know Bernie as well. He's kind of in that same spot where his needs as a technician and shop owner gave birth to a lot of what he's developed over the years. And as far as someone, again, starting off in the field to become a top trainer, John Thornton. I mean, here's a guy that his primary role, and I think probably still is as a mobile tech and helping shops with their diagnostic challenges. And if you talk to John, he'll tell you, I don't want to do anything else. I don't want to put on brakes. I don't want to change tires. I don't want to run a shop. Yeah. I'm happy, going in and doing these diagnostic challenges. And there are those who are watching who know, as you do, that that whole Chicago crew up there have no problem getting together after work and tearing cars apart, breaking them on purpose to see what kind of scan data they're going to get, what kind of scope information they're going to get. So like you said, the love of that challenge, the love of that learning is kind of characteristic for all the what I would consider the top trainers. And it was our privilege to have many of them at the Auto Mechanica back in Atlanta earlier this year. And I want to kind of tie into that. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me throw a point on what you just said there. So, you and I were lucky because, I mean, look at the changes we lived through here. Scott Brown and I talk about this a lot. Scott, if you're out there, hi. We've gone through points and condensers, cars that didn't change for years, and now we got self-driving cars. So for all the younger folks, one of the advantages of that is that we got to grow with the technology. Okay. So back in the old days, you had to learn electricity. You had to know what you're doing with measuring ohms and things like that. Today, you can get away with it, that you don't know it. Things are very complex, and so it's not a negative. Things are just very complex. Scan tools give you all this data. So, and sometimes you can just replace parts and get it over with, right? But for the older generation, whose goal was to develop an expertise and learn, we got to start with the very basics. We got to grow with it. And it was harder to learn back then, just like Pete talked about, because you couldn't go on the internet and type it in and get, people from all around the world to help you. You literally just had to get your hands dirty. You had to experiment. You could interface with people over time. And when the lab scopes came out, my AES waveform analysis program, the one that I wrote in DOS, Bevo, Scott Brown, and I can just list the name of everyone. Everybody went out and took their lab scopes, hooked it up on every signal, and I think Bevo made a database with 1,000 waveforms in it. Just had to do the work to learn it because it wasn't anywhere at the time. So they developed these patterns of learning, and you still see that with those guys there, and that's what makes them so good at everything. Can you imagine you got 30 years of building your knowledge by getting out there and doing it? So today, things are different. It's easier. And this goes important to becoming a trainer today. It's very important to know the difference between knowing something and truly understanding it. And those are important variables if you want to get into training. So yeah, I know something enough to go out and train it. But what these guys do is I know it, I understand it, I got my hands dirty, I've lived and breathed it, I have fought it, I have taken it apart, I have put it together. And just let me talk about training for a second. So when you get a chance to go see these guys at a training seminar, here's a secret. It's not just about the technical stuff that they're talking about. It's also about who they are. Look at these guys. Think about the way they're talking. Think about the way they're thinking, how they're structuring things. I've known a lot of great trainers over the years, built personal relationships with them. And one of the things that I like to do is study what makes them so good. What can I tell about their personalities, the way they talk? And, that's one of the great values that you can also get by going to their seminars. Bernie has his technique. Bernie, love you, man. He's a serial thinker, and that's what makes him so good. He starts on a track, and he will go to the nth degree to find the answer. And it's an amazing thing. And again, for me, it's all just like this celebration of automotive. I mean, it's just, what an amazing thing and just wonderful ride this has been. But yeah, those guys exemplify what it is to be the real deal. Yeah, because they're getting a hand, put it all together.
Oh yeah, and I know this is something that we've talked about. Again, we had quite the lineup at Auto Mechanica, and these guys show up at just about every major event across the country. And to a man, and I'm only speaking about the technical instructors. There's a lot of great guys on the management side too, but I always focus on the technical side. And to a man, every single one that I've ever met, including yourself, again, is at that event to teach. Number one, to help the people that are sitting in that classroom with them. And it doesn't matter. Sometimes we've had situations where, we've had 200 in a room, and maybe sometimes it's 10, but it doesn't matter, because if those 10 leave that room a little bit better off, a little bit better able to make a living, take care of their family, do the job a little easier, then the time that we got to spend with them was worth it, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, and I wanted to kind of reiterate on, yeah, we kind of grew up during this whole explosion of technology, but not too long ago, General Motors CEO, Ms. Mary Barra, I think if the name's right, made a comment that she expects that we'll see more change in the next 10 years than we have in the last 50. So that technology rate is just accelerating at a rapid pace. And like you mentioned, we have autonomous vehicles. The only thing that's really keeping them from I mean, I think I saw GM has got one that's going to be in production in 2019. So that's any time now they'll release that. And this is an autonomous vehicle, no steering wheel, no pedals, but it's going to be released for sale. But the biggest holdup is we don't have the regulations in place to govern them yet. So that's it's not the technology that they're waiting on. That's there. It's just getting everything on the same page. And so much more, all these ADAS systems that we talked about. And then in tying into that, you had made that connection. We had to go out and farm that knowledge. We had to learn it sometimes the hard way, through trial and error, busted knuckles, broken parts, whatever the case might be. Sometimes we get together with the guy down the street or with another tech in our shop, But now you've got Google. But the scary part about Google or any kind of internet, YouTube, whatever the case might be, is again the reliability of the person creating that material. And
Right.
especially when it comes to ADAS. I recently attended the Automotive Aftermarket Suppliers Association Technology Conference down here in Florida. And Dirk Fuchs with ZF was there. He's the technical training guy for them. And he was asked how many technicians in the United States were capable of handling the calibration requirements of ADS systems. And he commented maybe 0.5%. And that's kind of scary. He said, and he backed that up with a story of visiting a local shop and asking them if they did ADAS calibrations. Shop owner says, yeah, sure. So he asked him to see how they set it up, how they did it. The guy pulls out a door he bought at Home Depot that he had painted white and put some black dots on. And that was his target. And it's like, and I don't want to get too off tangent on this. I guess the point I want to make is we have that rapid advance in technology. We're developing systems that we've always mentioned safety for our customers when we're working on their car and making sure you do the brakes right and the front end work right for that reason. But now you're looking at systems that are designed to protect the occupants of that vehicle in the case of an impending collision. And if you don't have it right, that system's not going to work the way it's supposed to if somebody gets hurt. And
so
go ahead.
Yeah, let me throw this at you. So right now we're going to see all of this is there's a lot of not good things going on in the industry right now. You got the roof issue in that crash. You got this limousine that just crashed with a brake problem. You got these Ford dealer where they fixed a tire and the tire went out and a big lawsuit came out of it. It was very dangerous. Now we got ADAS. So it is my position that right now it's a good idea to keep a lot of noise up in the industry when it has to come to this stuff, because we've got to make sure that everybody is covered and understands what the variables are and the potential consequences. So personally, when I look at things starting at the shop floor. So my goal would be, number one, we got to protect technicians. And in this particular case, the technicians are the weakest link. Then on top of the technicians, you got the shop owners. What do shop owners need to know to protect themselves as we start getting cars that can take control and make decisions? And then this goes all the way up to the big corporations and everybody in between. So I think it's been important. There's been a lot of talk about it recently, and I think that's an important thing to do. And, right now we need to find out what the liability insurance companies have to say. Technicians and their bosses might want to talk about it if they get involved in it, to make sure they have a line of communication as to what's right and wrong, and the documentation. In this potentially, we've always talked about, well, what about licensing or something like that, which is a very complex problem. But at some point, especially with self-driving cars that are so smart, this might be a time for us to look at making a line. And Scott Brown's been talking about how the airplane industry has their system set up, and that might be a good model. But something should be done. And just think about this: when we start having self-driving cars, what happens when it ages out? They're going to have to crush it because it can't come out into the aftermarket, especially when technology keeps changing fast. So anyway, there's lots of great opportunities here. And changing the subject just a little, one of the greatest things about automotive repair is I don't have to have a degree. I can just have an idea. I can be living out in the middle of nowhere and make an impact on the industry and make something happen. I mean, look at all the mobile techs out there who are doing just wonderful jobs, and just think about what they're doing. These mobile techs are going out and helping these other shops that maybe can't afford to invest into that level of technician. They're helping those guys be successful, and it also helps to hopefully, encourage them to want to step up to the plate and get involved in the industry. And, it's about this communication. It's about trickle down. It's about trickle up. And, again, going back to the safety thing, it's about protecting everybody, starting at the shop floor, the weakest link. And it's, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. I knew when we talked about doing this event that the time was going to fly by. It certainly has. But there is an area that I know that we both wanted to make sure we hit on before we called an end to today's event. Mm-hmm. And it kind of goes right in the line of what we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be the one. I'm going to admit that a year ago, if either one of my boys had told me they wanted to go in this business, I would have beat them with a short piece of rope. I just felt that at that time, what it took to get involved in this business, the amount of personal investment a person had to make, and the earnings potentials at the time were just not where they should be. Now,
right.
I kind of feel a little differently about it. I think these changing technologies are opening up a world of opportunities for young men and women, or anyone for that matter. Even if you're a technician working full time now, there are so many opportunities that are branching off of this business that yes. You can pretty much go where you want, do what you want, and if you don't feel you're getting treated right by the shop you're working for, there's a shop out there that will take you on in a heartbeat if you know what you're doing. The other thing I wanted to kind of lead into the discussion, though, was we talked about, and people are always talking about, the technician shortage. We're not going to go into that area because we've hit that. Technician education reform, which is ongoing, which I think is great. But one of the things that we wanted to touch on was the new breed of trainer coming up. Because again, you look at the guys who are the top in the industry who headline these training events around the country. We're all getting older. Right, and sooner or later, right. There's a new crowd that needs to come up behind us. And I, for one, we know quite a few. I'm sure we won't mention any names, but we know that there's quite a few up and comers that are out there. And I think that I'd like to offer them and others like them some sage advice. Maybe tap into your experience and see what you might have to offer them.
So let me step back just a little bit and reframe it a little bit. Let's say somebody's out there that wants to get into training. So as opposed to just talking about folks that are in training today. So one of the things that I look at it, and the advice that I give you depends on what level you're at, but let's say you want to become the expert. So if you want to become an expert in training, literally an expert in whatever it is you're training, I think there's 5 basic variables. All right. So one of the variables is who you are. Because for me, part of the fun is, when Adam Roberts comes into Fresno and does a class and he stops by, I know Adam Roberts because it's who he is that is the engine that powers his classes. Bernie, he's the engine. John, he's the engine. So that's the number one variable right there. Second is, well, I'm not going to say number one variable. I'll just list this number as the first one I'm talking about. Number 2 is your ability to deliver. You have got to practice delivering. Go watch John. He's an expert at delivery. He focuses on it. I think his ability to deliver, and it shows. And so I could name other people as well. The third variable is what you know. What do you know? How much do you know? So if you're going to learn a subject, how much do you really know about it? So a little bit about that. When I first started doing training, I was scared to death. I think there was about 150, 200 people in there. It was the AESwave trade show down south. And you know what I did? And this is very important advice for anyone who wants to get into training, is I tapped into my power engine. And my power engine was my insecurity about doing this. So And this is very important. It's not all about being cocky and stuff like that. I was completely opposite. I was scared to death. Do I know enough? I had no idea because I had hardly ever been to a training class. So I used my insecurity to drive me to make sure that I not only knew my subject, but I knew this much beyond it. And it turned out that was very important during the class, because sometimes I'd get nervous. Someone would ask me a question, I'd answer it, and then I'd literally forget what I was talking about, and I'd have to ask somebody in the front row, what was I talking about before the question? And so Ken Friedman, a good friend of mine, came up to me later, and I go, how'd I do? He goes, well, you did okay, but you know what was good? You knew what you were talking about, okay? And I also had practical experience. So those three variables are who you are, your ability to deliver, and what you know. Now, today, this is extremely important because you can go on YouTube and know a lot of stuff. If I ask you 5 questions and you can answer them all, you might know the answer. But here's the bottom line. To be the expert, you have to understand it. And there's a big difference. And this goes into that idea of self-awareness about the principles I teach in my class. You got to have good self-awareness because there's a huge difference in I know something versus I understand it. You might know what an engine is, but unless you have built one, how good do you really understand it? You build it and you master all the parts and pieces and how they go together. That's the foundation of your understanding. So that's key to becoming an expert. And then the final thing in becoming an expert is your personal experience in dealing with it. Like we were talking about John and those guys who get together. Harvey used to organize some of those events. What do? They get their hands dirty. They break it. They fix it. And it's that practical experience that makes a difference. So now, if you're kind of in the middle of being a trainer, just kind of going up the stair steps, probably the most important thing is knowledge and understanding. But if you want to be that expert, everything changes. And in my opinion, if you want to be the expert, then the weight, if you put everything on a scale, I think the weight goes into who you are. Because if you are just have that magic of getting things across, that makes all the difference. You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you can't get it across, it doesn't do you any good. So, and you've got to be able to make that relationship with the people you're talking to, and you've got to be able to relate to them. And so that becomes the key thing, because all of the other stuff is in place. If you can be smartest person, but it becomes about who you are and your ability to deliver. Now, here's another tip that I would give people is if you want to get into training, I grew up in a large family. So I have this tendency to, if my older brothers are doing this and my younger brothers are doing that, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to try to do something different. And so what I would suggest, if my son were in automotive, tried to get into training, I would say, look around at what everyone else is doing. Find out what they're missing and focus on that, especially if it's extremely relevant, and tie it in to not just the technical aspect, not just the repair, but tie it into who they are. Okay. And again, I cannot stress this. If you got insecurity about it, turn it into an advantage. That is a powerful motivator for you to become as good as you can be. And so anyway, those are some tips.
And it worked out really. Guys, we didn't plan this. Okay, it just worked out that way. That last few minutes from George was just, as we would say in the business, that's soundbite gold. Everything he said there just made so much sense and had such practical applications. Not even just going to be, if you're looking at going to aftermarket as a trainer, trying to break into that field. Of course, there is seems to be across the industry a higher demand, which is always a good thing. I know that CarQuest is beefing up, NAPA's beefing up. Every major training organization I know of has been beefing up their numbers.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and it's wonderful. I love it because that means that people are coming to classes, which is a good thing. But even as a comment that came up here on Facebook said, it's not just the aftermarket events; it's the school, and I think that's another challenge that we've talked about before. But that's going to be the topic for another time, I'm afraid, because my buddy George here, I told him I'd only keep him for about an hour. We're well past that.
Oh,
as
it's
we
already been
speak.
an hour. Yeah.
It went by quick, as I knew it would, George. I thank you again for coming out and hanging out with me. And now that we have kind of the bugs or getting some of the kinks worked out, maybe we'll have to do this again.
Yeah, that'd be great. Pete, I really appreciate it. And, you know, I hope you don't mind a bit of a closing statement.
Please.
Is that, this has been an exciting time to be involved in automotive. It's even getting more exciting. You look at the complexity, it is an opportunity. But it's a collective. It's about all of us coming together. And in fact, here's a quick scenario from my experience is, when the lab scopes came out to me, that was the mark of the age of the technician. Before we had the big engine analyzers, only the shop owners couldn't afford it. Now we have these portable lab scope. A technician can afford to have it. And not only did it help them fix cars at a whole new level, but it helped them learn about cars. And then after that happened, then CompuServe came on, which was the beginning of the online community. And this was real important because that's when things really changed, because now it became the time of working together. It became the time of, how do I say it, helping each other to be successful. Mm-hmm. And you know what that did? And this was exciting. And people still feel this excitement today. All of a sudden, you're friends with people all over the world. And then the trade shows. Think about how that affected the trade shows, because that was the place where you went to meet each other.
Right.
And what was it about? It's about building a community. It's about helping each other. So, that's pretty exciting. It's been a wonderful journey. But the bottom line is there's opportunities here, but we got to take care of each other.
Absolutely. And again, I just want to thank you for taking the time to hang out with me. I know you've got a lot going on managing your business and coming up with new ideas.
Never enough time.
Never enough time. And to all those who came out to watch us on Facebook Live, thank you so much. I've been watching the comments as we go. Looks like you guys enjoyed it, which means I guess we'll have to make plans for another one coming up pretty soon. So until then, this is Pete Meier at Shop Talk on Facebook Live. See you next time.
Pete, thank you.